Okay, folks. So we're going to go over the next part of the not prehistory, but the earlier Native American history. This part is going to focus on the founding of the U.S. essentially up until the turn of the 20th century. There is a bit of time prior to European conquest and Native or basically the Revolutionary War that I think is important, but I'm not going to stress here only because the conception of Native societies really emerges more in this moment as it pertains to the U.S. As we saw with the last lecture, obviously European contact led to huge demise in Native societies. Frankly, that we lost about 90% of the native population, 112 160 million down to 11 million or so. One thing to note with that is that was the advent of biological warfare, with the use of smallpox blankets, and the spreading of diseases by Europeans as a mechanism to you know not decimate, but largely weaken those societies, and then, sorry, to weaken the societies, and then that weakening enabled the more, or enabled the European colonizers to essentially conquer these folks. It wasn't necessarily that they were outgunned or outmatched, as we saw in some of the previous videos. It was actually that basically diseases just ravaged these communities and they weren't able to kind of rebound from that. And largely because of the advancements that Native societies had, right? In part that they had, I'm sorry, that they had, bathing techniques, medicinal techniques that had, staved them off from a lot of the medieval diseases like typhus, smallpox, diphtheria, plague, so on and so forth. Their inability to have antibodies and antigens or medicines to deal with these diseases put them in a very precarious position when European colonizers brought their filth, for lack of a better term, to these regions, right? These societies were heavily advanced, mostly vegan, had elaborate social systems that were much more egalitarian, democratically progressive, so on and so forth, that were unlike, and I would argue, much more advanced than European societies. And actually, that level of advancement, as we're going to see in this lecture, informed many of the ways in which our early democracy happened. However, those entrenched notions of race and racism and the US's desire to expand west for capitalist gains, which has obviously always been a motivator for the exploitation of people of color, is what led to further war with Native peoples and their demise. And one thing to note again, right, is that a lot of what we're learning about over the semester and through this course has been how notions of race and racism, one, have developed and, obviously existed and persisted in our society, and what has been the consequence. And we're going to see this more in detail here, how this construction of natives as other has enabled, right, their colonization, conquest, decimation, so on and so forth, which is, propped up the U.S. empire or these other empires, but, at what expense, right? The destruction, the annihilation, the extinction of communities. And as we saw last time, right, we actually had the extinction of native communities as a result of, this contact, right? So first, let's talk about what we're going to talk about today, which is, oops, I didn't do a lecture layout. Sorry. So early U.S. and natives, right? So what this actually looks like around the Revolutionary period, the U.S. government and Indian relations, and we're going to see that changes dramatically. Early treaties and betrayals, and what we're going to see in the 19th century is basically just this century of betrayal. This idea that the U.S. in some ways had always or wanted to have some kind of normal or peaceful relations with indigenous communities, but from Washington all the way up until Teddy Roosevelt, there was never really this peaceful kumbaya between the two groups. The U.S. vehemently wanted to move west to take land and resources, and did so with impunity in terms of the violence that was deployed against indigenous folks, right? A lot of this westward expansion was justified through manifest destiny, which is going to be our general key term for today. This also led to a shift in Indian policy. I want to talk a little bit about the Trail of Tears as one of the big kinds of pieces of U.S. racial violence with Native communities. We're going to talk a little bit more about the continued Indian War and much of the century, although the U.S. engaged in a civil war, a war with Mexico, a war with Spain, and several other different communities. It was constantly at war with natives in effort to move west. The escalation of these Indian wars and then the end of them around the time of Wounded Knee, which is just before the turn of the 20th century. We're going to get into detail on manifest destiny here, and I want to talk about it a little bit more at length later on. But just so we have a general definition of it, it was the belief that the U.S. should expand throughout the American continent, and that it was both justified and inevitable, right? So that the U.S. had kind of elevated itself, or American leaders had elevated themselves socially, politically, and intellectually to say that essentially they had the right to, and no matter what, they were going to go west. Okay. And so indigenous communities, whoever was there, no matter what, they were doing this at any cost. Right. And so part of this belief was divined through or seen through the sense of God, that basically the U.S. was destined by God and spiritual leaders to expand, its dominion across the northern continent. And specifically to expand both democracy and capitalism, right? And one thing to note, and what we saw a little bit last time, and what we've obviously come to learn about over the course of this semester, is that American democracy was deeply flawed. One that, obviously after the ratification of the Constitution, no one other than property owning white men had political, civil, or any kind of social rights. So taking this understanding of manifest destiny and saying that this was the ultimate thing that needed to happen and that it was the best thing to happen, I think is a flawed characteristic. And then also, as we're going to learn about in a second, because of the differences between politics between American societies and Native American societies, there had to have been a lot of intellectual work to cast these folks as inferior, to one, say that American democracy was better than Native democracy, which fundamentally it wasn't, because Native American democracy was much more inclusive. But also, right, we had to denigrate all of those social and scientific advancements that we saw in the previous lecture, to the extent to show that Americans were better, right? And so manifest destiny in and of itself was not this kind of happenstance notion. And I want to be very clear that it's a part of the racist and racial framework that the U.S. Constructed through its, social evolution. And we need to have a much more concerted conversation when we teach this and further explore this when we're sharing this knowledge in the future, because manifest destiny, like Columbus sailing the ocean blue in 1492, is not something that is just this fairy tale myth of exploration, but rather a kind of concerted logic and then obviously a concerted effort to move west, to take lands and people, and to do so through race-based and racist logic that led to huge decimation of societies and communities, across the continental Americas. So indigenous communities often play a paradoxical role in the U.S. And what I mean by that is, and as we'll see in this video, natives become this central role and central people in our culture. And we use a lot of their technologies, i.e., or one most prominent is that we, use a lot of the farming and hunting and even guerrilla warfare practices to stave off the British Empire, the French Empire, and other folks that tried to colonize us in the past. And then we were able to survive in large part because Native peoples had taught the Pilgrims and early colonists to farm and manage the land. So they were integral in terms of their teachings to enable the colonies to form and the U.S. democracy to emerge. And we, heavily relied on them to actually fight, European colonial forces, but we never really fully included them. And much of westward expansion and the constitutional framework specifically excluded these people from having political rights, which is very key to understand because, again, the Constitution in and of itself, whether or not you want to think of it this way, is a racist document. It denied people of color and sexist, by extension, women, rights to vote and political rights in the new world or in the new American order. And so because of that, all of the subsequent treaties and also the subsequent political relationships that emerged in the subsequent years with the U.S. were predicated on this sense of democracy, but never really articulated this. And as I'll talk about a little bit later, this is how we see a lot of treaty violations, for example, with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, where the U.S. promises inclusion, but never fully grants it.
The Iroquois. The Iroquois Confederacy. The people of the Iroquois Confederacy, also known as the Six Nations, refer to themselves as the Haudenosaunee. It means peoples of the Longhouse and refers to their lengthy bark-covered longhouses that housed many families. The Iroquois, or Haudenosaunee Confederacy of Upper New York and southeastern Canada, is often characterized as one of the world's oldest participatory democracies. It was originally made up from 5 nations: the Mohawk, Oneida, Onondaga, Cayuga, Seneca, and later joined by the Tuscarora. The Confederacy's constitution, the Great Law of Peace, is believed to have been a model for the U.S. Constitution, partly because Benjamin Franklin was known to have been much interested in its structure. According to their founding tradition, the Peacemaker story, these Iroquois peoples, who had been at war with each other for a long time, came together to live in peace and harmony after Hiawatha, a mourning Onondaga chief, joined a man who was known as the Peacemaker in pursuing unity among the Iroquois. Some believed this happened in the late 1100s, and some believed it happened in the late 1500s, as the story is carried orally and it's not written down. The great Peacemaker and the wise Hiawatha traveled to each of the 5 nations to share their ideas for peace. A council meeting was called, and Hiawatha presented the Great Law of Peace, or what would later be known as the Iroquois Constitution. It united the 5 nations into a League of Nations, the Iroquois Confederacy, and became the basis for the Iroquois Confederacy Constitution. Each nation maintained its own leadership, but they all agreed that common causes would be decided in the Grand Council of Chiefs. The concept was based on peace and consensus rather than fighting. The Peacemaker established clans within the nations of the Iroquois Confederacy. The clan system united the nations and ensured peace among them. The Peacemaker also set up the Iroquois society as matrilineal. This meant clan members traced their family history and ancestors through their mothers. Each clan was made up of a group of families that had a common female ancestor. When people married, the husband moved into his wife's longhouse. When a child was born, he or she became part of the mother's clan. Members of the same clan were considered family members, so they always extended hospitality to each other, even if they came from different nations. Also, people of the same clan did not marry each other. Within each nation, members of the same clan lived together in a longhouse. The Iroquois lived in settlements made up of several longhouses. Longhouses were large, open dwellings where many families of the same clan lived together. The Longhouse was an important place in the government of the Iroquois. It was where men and women met to discuss issues and events and to advise their leaders. People were expected to attend these discussions because the consensus or agreement of the group was crucial. Clan mothers were usually the oldest and most respected women in their clans. The title was hereditary and passed on to the woman relative that was thought to be best suited for the position. Clan mothers were responsible for their clan's welfare and for maintaining harmony and balance within the clans and nations. They selected the male chiefs, called Hoyana, which means caretakers of the peace. The Great Law of Peace stated that the chiefs had to put the needs of their people first. The clan mothers would replace chiefs who failed to do this. Within each clan, there was a women's council and a men's council. These councils advised the clan mothers, who then advised the chiefs, and vice versa. Although they rarely spoke at Grand Council meetings, all Iroquois people, men and women, had ways to make their voices heard in the decision-making of the Grand Council. Through the women's councils and men's councils of their clans, they advised the clan mothers of their positions on issues. The clan mothers, in turn, chose and advised the chief. If the chief didn't carefully consider the advice of his clan mother, the clan mother warned him. After the third warning, she removed him and chose someone else. The Longhouse was used by the peacemaker and Hiawatha as a symbol to represent the union, the culture, and the tradition of the Iroquois Confederation, and how their territory should be shared. The three largest tribes held important positions within the Confederation, which relate to the structure of the Longhouse. The Mohawk were the easternmost group and considered to be the keepers of the eastern door. The Seneca, the largest nation, were known as the keepers of the western door. The Onondaga were known as the keepers of the central council fire, and the main Onondaga village served as the capital and meeting place of the council. The Grand Council met to discuss issues that affected the whole Iroquois Confederacy, such as peace treaties, trade agreements, and decisions to go to war. The Grand Council was made up of chiefs from each nation, 50 in all. Within each nation, the chiefs formed a council for that nation. This council made decisions that helped its nation function well, such as sharing resources and locating settlements. The Grand Council met when a member nation called for a meeting. The role of the chiefs at Grand Council meetings was to represent the people of their clan and nation. The clan mothers attended the Grand Council meetings to make sure their chiefs fulfilled their role as representatives. The Grand Council was made from 50 chiefs. The number of chiefs for each nation was established by the peacemaker. The Seneca had 8, the Mohawk had 9, the Onondaga had 14, the Cayuga had 10, and the Oneida had 9 chiefs. The Seneca and the Mohawk being the older brothers, the Oneida and the Cayuga being the younger brothers, and the Onondaga being keepers of the council fire. First, the elder brothers, the Mohawk and the Seneca, discussed the issue among themselves. When they reached a decision, they passed their consensus across the sacred fire to the younger brothers, the Oneida and Cayuga. The elder brothers listened while the younger brothers discussed the matter and arrived at their own consensus. When the older brothers and younger brothers agreed, the Onondaga, the keepers of the council fire, would be asked to give their judgment. Council decisions had to be unanimous, so the Grand Council always worked toward consensus. If some party disagreed in the process, the council had to be restarted until all sides came to a common decision. In 1722, the Confederacy was joined by the Tuscarora people, who lost the war against the Europeans and migrated north. They shared the same language and culture as the other nations. After that, the Grand Council decided the Tuscarora would join them. However, they were not given any representation in the council. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed the content, please consider...
So as you can see, there's an elaborate social system, lots of fundamental aspects of democracy here. But again, much more egalitarian, following a kind of feminist framework, as women had much more power and control. And given the kind of inherent sexism and patriarchy of the constitutional framework, this again is what becomes at odds with the way in which the U.S. wants to see itself as a kind of capitalistic and masculinist kind of society, which enables this kind of logic of dehumanization for these indigenous people. So the U.S. attempted to have peaceful relationships with the tribes in subsequent years. George Washington originally sought to develop a policy of justice and humanity with natives, but he wanted the natives to also to assimilate, essentially. And he thought the best way to deal with natives was to either welcome them in or to forcibly assimilate them and make them Americans, right? And then this becomes one of the most earliest examples of ethnocentrism or ethnocentric racism in the U.S., where we deny indigenous people their cultural significance and say that the only way that they can exist and be, civilized or a part of the social fabric is by, shedding their previous culture and becoming American. And as we saw in the earlier example, clearly their democracy was light years ahead of what the U.S. was even considering at the time. So Washington then changed his position on natives, and as the U.S. again hoped to settle the West and manifest destiny started to become a central kind of guiding feature, he had instructed many of his leaders of the Department of War, what we now call the Department of Defense, to lay waste to all settlements around that country that may not be merely overrun but destroyed, when he was talking about indigenous settlements, and then not to listen to any overture of peace before the total ruin of their settlements was effective. So he wanted to burn everybody to the ground, and then after that, then talk about peace, right? So Washington's stance on natives was echoed by many subsequent presidents, where tribes were seen as the Indian problem. And this is actually the emergence of the Indian problem, as we've seen with other communities of color that we've seen in this, or we've discussed in this course. Each subsequent community becomes a problem. We had the Negro problem or the slave problem. We had the Mexican problem. And likewise, we've had the Native problem. And in part because the problem is, or what the US framework is trying to evince here or show here, is that we have a paradox in the way in which we want to see ourselves as a country, either racially homogenous, socially progressive, capitalistic, so on and so forth. And the presence of non-white people exploited in some ways, maybe utilized in different ways, maybe are not, or because of transitions in political dynamics, i.e. Civil rights, social justice, so on and so forth, the new emergence of racial relations become the problem, right? So, for example, when we freed slaves, the problem initially was slaves, right? So we didn't know what to do with slavery at the time because the South was getting too much power. And so we had this Southern kind of Negro, quote unquote, problem. We free all the slaves, but then we create the system of Jim Crow. Then we fight all of these wars during World War II against Nazi Germany and fascists, and then realize that we're also doing this, and so do the communities of color being exploited. So then we have a new, race problem, new Negro problem, as African Americans are striving for social justice and saying, hey, we're not getting our fair share of the pie, which was guaranteed to us by the Constitution. We shift our political dynamics. We now move into mass incarceration. And now the problem is no longer the Negro problem, because we're in a post-race society and we don't discuss race anymore. But now we have a mass incarceration problem, still very much enmeshed in race. And now, again, challenging the fundamental structure of our society, which is capitalistic and relying on exploitation, or in this case, the removal of unwanted African Americans who are the descendants of slaves. And now that we're not using slavery anymore, we have to deal with these people. Likewise, with Mexican Americans and Latinos more generally, the initial problem was that they were in the Southwest, right? They were in this area that we hoped to colonize. And so the Mexican problem was then settled by conquest, right? We fought a war with Mexico. We took all those lands. so on and so forth. Then the new Mexican problem was how to deal with their citizenship. Well, we technically guaranteed them citizenship, but we actually fully never did that, right? The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo did say that we would grant Mexican American citizenship or Mexican citizenship so they wanted, but they were relegated to a second-class status, right? And so they become this new Mexican problem as we're trying to reconcile them as this subordinate status. In the 1970s or the late 60s, and early 1970s, the Bracero program and the Chicano movement essentially show the U.S. as, again, like we saw with the African American civil rights movement, not including or not granting full citizenship to people of color, and so therefore they fight protests or they engage in protests, challenging that. Now the new Mexican problem is now the new illegal immigrant problem, like mass incarceration, and we're going to see this in the future with the reservation problem here in terms of Indians. Is that now we have this new Indian problem with the U.S. wanting to expand west, indigenous folks being there, and what to do with them in terms of, whether we give them citizenship or not. And as we've seen, and as I'm going to discuss more here, Indians being, non-white never allowed them to be citizens. And so peace between the U.S. governments and tribal nations were always tenuous. America was fairly concerned about being reconquered, but they also had this growing desire to become a superpower like other empires. And they were guided by this kind of weird tension between not wanting to become a monarchy and not become, tyrannical as European societies had been in the past. But they also wanted to, be established and have economic systems and all that good stuff too, right? And so as a result, leaders start to sign various treaties with, tribal nations in an effort to establish peace, but they never had any intention of honoring these. And some of the early treaties I provided here show kind of what happened. So one of the very first one is the Delawares and the Fort Pitt Treaty of 1778. This is undone when Pennsylvania militiamen kill over 100 Lenape people who were mostly women and children, and the assassination of women and children by American militiamen, or the assassination of Native women and children by American militiamen, was a common tactic in fighting the Indian Wars. The Treaty of Hopewell in 1785 and 86 was violated because white settlers continued to move on to Native American territories. The Treaty of Canandaigua, Pickering, and Calico was undone because the U.S. government continued to reduce Iroquois land. And then the Treaty of Greenville in 1775 was nullified, again, due to this kind of continued westward expansion. And so, again, a primary factor preventing peace from between the U.S. and natives was Manifest Destiny. The Manifest Destiny, again, was built on two main principles: the expansion of the U.S. throughout the American continent, that it was both justified and inevitable, and that it was divined by God. And I provided a couple of different pictures here to kind of showcase this. So on the top, this is an early artistic rendition of what Manifest Destiny was supposed to be seen as. It's supposed to be angelic, with this kind of angel moving west, pushing out indigenous folks and bringing railroads, the wagon, and horse-drawn carriages and settlers west. Here we can see territorial acquisitions from 1783 to 1853. Obviously, the United States expands extremely west through the early Indian Wars here through 1783. The Louisiana Purchase allows for the purchasing of Florida in this kind of Midwestern region. We annexed Texas. We annexed Texas and forced Mexico to cede most of the Southwest in the mid 1840s, and then in the late 1840s, British claims to Oregon country are extinguished as we basically take over the entire region. And so the U.S. was just basically guided at this point just to take as much land as possible, and did so, with overt force. So the 1800s mark a dramatic shift in Indian policy where conquest and theft were primary motivators, again, justified by manifest destiny. Thomas Jefferson and Andrew Jackson are the two main architects of this, and their inherent racism, as we've seen with Thomas Jefferson, one being one of the primary justifiers of slavery. He himself, had a slave mistress, had a slave, and had children with her that he sold into slavery. Andrew Jackson was an ardent Indian fighter, and helped to secede much of the Southeast territories as a soldier in the American Army. And both of these folks encouraged war with and the removal of native peoples, right? And so I want to show this video really quick, and then I'll talk about the two acts that they helped to kind of co-develop.
Hello and welcome to History Pod. On the 28th of May, 1830, President Andrew Jackson signed the Indian Removal Act into law. The arrival of European colonists in the Americas caused almost immediate conflict with the indigenous populations, as both sides fought to secure land and natural resources. Following the War of Independence, the newly independent government under George Washington had implemented a policy of acculturation, in which Native American rights would be respected in return for them adopting European customs. However, the early 19th century saw the rapid increase in the arrival of white settlers. Many of these sought the fertile lands of the southeastern United States, but these were the ancestral home of a number of indigenous tribes, and so they pressured the federal government to help. In 1814, while serving as a general in the United States Army, Andrew Jackson secured more than 20 million acres of land in present-day Georgia and Alabama from the Creek Confederacy. On becoming president in 1829, he began to advocate for the relocation of Indian populations to land west of the Mississippi River. This led to the creation of the Indian Removal Act, which was controversial even at the time. After passing the House on the 26th of May by a narrow margin of 101 votes to 97, Jackson signed it into law 2 days later. The act required the government to negotiate treaties with the tribes, and while some did sign agreements with the American government, many others refused to leave their ancestral homes. As a result, tens of thousands of Native Americans were forcibly resettled by the military. Between 1838 and 1839, more than 4,000 Cherokees alone died of cold, hunger, and disease during the infamous Trail of Tears that saw approximately 17,000 tribal members forced to undertake a grueling march of more than 1,200 miles.
So, and I'll talk about the Trail of Tears in a second. So, the Indian Removal Act and the Indian Appropriation Act are two key laws that emerged from this moment. And as explained, right, the Indian Removal Act allowed for, the president to grant lands west of the Mississippi, in exchange for those existing state borders. And it basically, was this kind of grab for all of the land east of the Mississippi, justify the removal of these populations. This gave rise to what was called the Indian Appropriation Act, which will lead to the Trail of Tears in a minute, which created an Indian reservation system. And so essentially, as the Indians are removed, or Native American communities are removed because of the Indian Removal Act, the U.S. government sets aside certain lands for these folks to live on. But as we'll see in future lectures, this land becomes less and less and less over time, and the amount of Indian territory or Indian country becomes significantly reduced as the U.S. is guided by and wants to take as much land as possible. So, again, the Indian Removal Act justifies what's called the Trail of Tears, and this is actually a very historic trek. As you can see, it spans much of the southeast region, the Georgia, Alabama, parts of Louisiana, Mississippi, and Florida. All of these different communities were removed here: the Cherokee, the Creek, the Chickasaw, the Seminole, and the Choctaw. into what was now considered to be modern day Oklahoma. About 60,000 Native people were removed from 5 different tribes into what were considered to be the first reservations. They had to cross up to 9 states, over 5,000 miles to reach their final destination. And consequently, almost 4,000 people died from disease, starvation, and exposure to frigid temperatures as they were doing this in the cold of winter. And you can actually walk this trail. It's a historic site, but it's considered to be one of the most damaging pieces of removal in the United States. And one thing to note about this, and what some scholars have tried to make an argument about, especially as we think about genocide and Holocaust. The Holocaust is often reserved for Nazi Germany, but there are historic antecedents here in the policy of Native communities. And I want to make a concerted argument to use Holocaust as an analytical framework to understand this. The removal of this many people from parts of the United States to one concentrated area, or what we would consider to be a concentration camp, has this kind of racist orientation. And what we haven't discussed it at length here, but Alex de Tocqueville, one of the earliest French scholars who was talking about American society, noted how skillful the United States was at killing Indians. And Hitler had often praised the US and these particular leaders on their genocidal policies because he used a lot of that thinking and rationalization in his war with European Jews or Germanic Jews. And we can see, obviously frameworks here, right? Like there's this concerted removal of lots of people. They're concentrated in an area, and that kills many, many people. And as we'll see in the future, or in the remainder of this lecture and in subsequent lectures, there's a big push to actually just destroy natives outright to remake America. So these native folks become the first kind of major enemy of the United States to kind of rally around and build America through. So during the Civil War, the U.S. gets temporarily distracted from the Indian problem because it's dealing with the U.S.-Mexico War and the Civil War. One thing to note, these two wars are still about race. So all of the 1800s wars are all fundamentally about race and citizenship, right? The Civil War is about whether or not to quote unquote free slaves or to extend slavery, right? So the dehumanization of, African peoples, African Americans at this time. Obviously, the U.S.-Mexico War is about taking Mexican land. And as we learned last time, or during the Mexican Latinx and Chicanx in the United States unit, part of the rationalization for that was that Mexico wasn't, taking care of their land or didn't deserve their land. And as a result, the U.S., or James K. Polk picked a fight essentially with Mexico after Texas tried to secede and take that over. After these wars end, Lincoln and his predecessors start to restart that focus on the Indian problem. He presides over one of the largest mass executions in U.S. history. I'm going to show this in a second during the U.S. Dakota Wars. And then one thing to note about this as well is that after the Civil War, we start to see a heavy reliance on poor white immigrants and freed African Americans as fighters for the war. And this will become or set a historic precedent where the U.S. will engage in wars over democracy and freedom with other countries or other foreign people, but not utilize the full scope of people in its citizenry. Rather, it will rely on poor whites and people of color to fight those wars. And this was something that was integral in the 1960s that was discussed, that it wasn't politicians and politicians' family members who were fighting these wars with the Viet Cong or other folks during the Cold War. It was always poor people of color and poor whites who were overly utilized to fight in these wars because their lives were considered to be expendable. So it was literally people of similar class structure being pitted against one another And the auspice of difference is fundamentally that one's American and one is not, right? In this case, Scots-Irish immigrants who are poor coming from, England and Ireland are now considered to be quote unquote American, although they're fundamentally just as poor as Native folks. And freed African Americans are also don't have the same kind of elevated political status or economic status as either Scots-Irish, and they're just slightly above Native folks, and they're pitted against one another to do so. And so I wanted to show this clip of what happened during this, because one of the things that's really important to note about this mass execution is the fact that we conducted this level of violence against Native people, which would in normal times be considered, egregious war crimes.
What happened on December 26th, 1862? Everything went off quietly, and the other prisoners are well secured. Henry H. Sibley to President Abraham Lincoln, December 27th, 1862. Following the Dakota trials, 303 Dakota men were sentenced to be executed by hanging. However, President Lincoln approved just 39 sentences, arguing that he did not want to act with so much clemency as to encourage another outbreak on the one hand, nor with so much severity as to be real cruelty on the other. Lincoln therefore condemned only those who had been found guilty of participating in the massacre of civilians rather than just battles. Shortly before the hangings, one more was pardoned, bringing the number to 38. The executions took place in Mankato, Minnesota at 10 a.m. on December 26, 1862, in what remains the largest mass execution in United States history. About 4,000 spectators overflowed the streets to witness the executions. In addition, there were 1,500 soldiers who, under martial law, had been instructed to maintain order. The 38 men were tied together with a white muslin cap covering their heads. The gallows were especially designed for this occasion and were all connected to one single rope. As the nooses were placed around each man's neck, they grasped hands and began singing in unison a traditional Dakota song. A drum beat signaled the beginning of the execution, causing the crowd and the men to become silent. With a single blow from an axe, Captain William Dooley, who had lost several family members during the war, cut the rope and ended the lives of the Dakota 38. 2 of those executed had been mistakenly hanged. This included Chaska, who had done much to protect Sarah Wakefield during the war, and Wassakoon, who had been previously acquitted. The bodies were left to hang for 30 minutes and then buried in a shallow mass grave in a sandbar near the Minnesota River. By morning, most of the bodies had been exhumed and taken by physicians for use as medical cadavers. 3 years later, Dakota leaders Shakopee and Medicine Bottle were hanged at Fort Snelling. The 2 had evaded capture in Canada, where, in 1864, they were kidnapped and smuggled over the border. After a brief trial with sketchy evidence, the 2 were found guilty of committing atrocities during the war. They were hanged on November 11, 1865.
And so this war becomes a part, or these wars become this kind of central point where we start to see the U.S. engage in what is not fully considered to be justifiable or civilized war, but rather just outright destruction of people that we don't like. And these mass executions, which were predicated on trials that were only 5 minutes at length, and obviously in the last example, the additional 2 who were hanged alongside the other Dakota 38, we see this kind of concerted effort to destroy Native people or our enemies at all costs. And this has been true of the U.S. engaging in a variety of sketchy tactics. We can think back to George H.W. Bush with the Iraq War, with the Iraq War, invading under false pretenses of weapons of mass destruction and, utilizing a variety of tactics to destroy communities in the Middle East with impunity, right? And so we continue, going back to this point, we continue to fight these wars, right, out west for land and resources. This was particularly important as we saw that gold, oil, and farmable lands were discovered in these areas. And particularly like in California, you know, gold deposits there become a big piece of trying to take that land from indigenous people. There's tons and tons of natural resources. There's large deposits of uranium in Arizona and New Mexico, which helped to obviously fuel the nuclear warfare that emerged in the 1940s. We also see that the utilization of poor whites and freed blacks become this kind of framework for engaging in war. The U.S. will pick fights with individuals or get caught up in wars, and rather than using the entire veracity of its citizenry, it's only going to use poor people or poor people of color to fight these wars, right? And so the U.S. is encouraging migration west as a result of this to essentially justify these wars. I've provided a couple advertisements here in the late 1800s showing this, where, you know, they're encouraging folks to move west. And this was so heinous that actually in 1873, the American government killed about 1.5 million buffalo in an effort to starve natives. This was only in 1 year. So they've been doing this for many years. You can see the pile of skulls here. But the American government used not only direct warfare, but indirect warfare in terms of burning crops, kidnapping children, killing women, destroying food sources to essentially just exterminate Indians. And again, what is interesting about this, and I want to make a concerted connection to how this works with mass incarceration in the war on drugs. The U.S. fought a total war on Indians, and what a total war means is that we utilize the full force and might of the U.S. Army, you know, as a catch-all for the entire military, the U.S. military, to destroy natives or destroy our enemy at all costs. And we see this here, the U.S. government killing off huge swaths of animals, right, that were a primary foodstuff to starve natives, killing folks in mass and publicly to show you know, what we'll do to the enemy if they act up, and in just engaging in all-out wars over time to, you know, defeat our enemy. And we did this with mass incarceration as well, in the sense that we gave law enforcement agency tanks, weapons, you know, let them train with military, so on and so forth, to defeat the enemy, which was, you know, ostensibly drugs, but realistically was people of color, as we saw with this kind of construction of race and criminality alongside drugs. So this all kind of comes to a head with the last major skirmish between the U.S. Army and Indians, which happened at the Battle of Wounded Knee in 1890. It's estimated about 300 Lakota people died at the hands of U.S. troops. This was both, you know, warriors and civilians. And so the U.S. never indiscriminately fought just soldiers. They fought everyone, and all Indians were essentially a potential target. This marked the end of the Plains Indian Wars and the outright militarism towards Native. However, as we're going to learn in subsequent lectures, this wasn't the only way that we dealt with Native or the Native problem. Rather, we used more indirect and cost-effective methods to do this. And one of those, namely with what we saw with the mass killing of buffalo, was to starve Native peoples, ensuring that they couldn't, you know, live on their own, and they had to actually rely on the U.S. government. And this video here will give a little bit more context and depth on what happened at Wounded Knee.
Hello and welcome to History Pod. On the 29th of December 1890, more than 150 Native Americans from the Lakota tribe were killed by US soldiers in the Wounded Knee massacre. The 19th century saw white settlers move westward across North America in accordance with the disputed ideology of manifest destiny. The resulting forced relocation of Native Americans led to a series of conflicts collectively known as the American Indian Wars. Yet, by 1890, settlers and gold miners had begun to encroach on the new reservations, while the bison, on which the people of the Great Plains depended, had been almost wiped out. In desperation, the native people began to turn to performing the ghost dance that promised to bring about a revival of their pre-European existence. White Americans, fearing that the ghost dance might be a prelude for war, decided to act. In a botched attempt to arrest the Lakota Sioux chief Sitting Bull, he was shot and killed. This raised tensions in the native community, resulting in hundreds of people, led by Chief Spotted Elk, opting to head for the safety of the Pine Ridge Reservation. Having been intercepted by a detachment of US 7th Cavalry, the Lakota set up camp near Wounded Knee Creek on the 28th of December. The next morning, Colonel James Forsyth ordered the Native Americans to surrender their weapons. Some sources then allege that a medicine man named Yellow Bird antagonized the US troops by performing the ghost dance. Meanwhile, a young Lakota named Black Coyote engaged in a scuffle after he refused to give up his rifle, possibly because he was deaf or he didn't understand the order to disarm. In the commotion that followed, a rifle discharged, prompting a frantic gunfight that killed at least 150 and possibly as many as 300 tribespeople, many of whom were old men, women, and children.
So that's going to be the wrap for today. We're going to get to some more nitty gritty in the next couple of lectures, but what we've learned is, obviously this early U.S. and natives, what that kind of looked like, the U.S. government and Indian relationships, which went from something of a more civilized peace and humanity to something more outright and war specific. And this kind of marked the century of betrayal. The 1800s is very marred in the U.S. by the sense of the Indian Wars and essentially the U.S. government creating a variety of treaties to try to deal with Indians, but never honoring those and actually just engaging in all-out warfare. A lot of this was, again, predicated on manifest destiny, which was this kind of sense that the U.S. was divined by God to move west, and it was inevitable and eventual. And then that allowed for this kind of shift in Indian policy where essentially we just went to all out war at any kind of expense, right? We started to move Indians from their ancestral homes through the Trail of Tears onto the reservation, and we had seen the establishment of the reservation project, which again has a kind of Holocaust framework in terms of concentration. We put Native peoples onto concentration camps, in these different territories. And then, we continued to fight wars with Indians, and as the war kind of continued, relying specifically on, poor white immigrants, Scots, Irishmen, and Buffalo soldiers or freed African Americans to fight those wars, which had, devastating consequences. We saw an example of that with the 38 hanging from the Dakota tribe. These wars continue to the extent that we had people continuously moving west, one, justifying the wars, but then also, the extermination of crops and of bison or buffalo to ensure that, Native American people would not have food sources to live on and therefore would become dependent on the U.S. government or, buckle at the will of U.S. might. And then this all kind of comes to a head at the Battle of Wounded Knee, which marks the end of the Indian Wars. And although the Indian Wars end in terms of its outright militarism, as we'll see, as I mentioned earlier in subsequent lectures, that the U.S. government is in no way ready to stop fighting Indians, but rather is starting to come up with more effective and indirect methodologies for doing so, rather than, relying on all-out war, which is one, very costly, right? Because it does cost a lot to, arm soldiers, but then also has a huge human toll as we continue to kill people and have that happen, right? And so lastly, and again, our major focus for this unit is on manifest destiny. So what we've covered the past two times is understanding of anachronism in the way in which we see natives, and then obviously manifest destiny in terms of thinking about natives as savage people, allowed for the U.S. to colonize this, continent or this region, casting natives as undeserving or backwards or uncivilized, and that, God basically had destined the U.S. to take this land over. Okay. So if you have any questions, as always, feel free to email me. We'll talk about this more in the next couple lectures. And with that, thank you for tuning in, and I'll see you next time.